This is Invent Anything's Inventors at Work, and I'm John Cronin. Boy, are we in for a treat today. We're interviewing Marty Cooper, who is known to be the father of the cell phone, and I know what you know a cell phone is. One of the great reads for you all is his book, Cutting the Cord, and it's such a fascinating story of his life at Motorola and as an inventor and how he got his inventions to come out, particularly the first cell phone. So we're very proud to have Marty here as our first Inventors at Work series. And thank you, Marty, for coming. And it's such an exciting story. It would be great if you might be able to just give us 3 to 5 minutes of kind of the story in a nutshell and sort of how you started and some of the aspects of that. Certainly I have a number of other questions to ask, so we'll ask those questions, but maybe you could tell a little bit about your story.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, John, and it's a great pleasure to be on your program. I have been an inventor all my life, and so I'm very sensitive to your subject. I don't think I've had as many inventions as you have, so I'm honored to be on your show, John. Since you mentioned my book, I ought to mention what the real theme of my book, or at least the fundamental theme, is that the concept of inventing, people keep talking about the eureka moment. I know you're familiar with it. I don't believe in that at all. I think every invention takes a foundation. It takes an understanding of technology. But the most important thing about inventions is understanding about people, because the whole definition of what technology is to me is the application of science to create products and services that make people's lives better. And if you don't make people's lives better, it's not technology, it's not an invention, it's just curiosity. And I was lucky enough in my career, the first stab of luck I had was the government put me through school. My folks probably could never have afforded it without that. And so I joined the Navy, and the Navy helped me grow up. And ultimately, I ended up at Motorola for 29 years. And Motorola tolerated me for 29 years because I never really fit into the corporate mold. And I'm very grateful to Motorola for what they did for me. So I think that really is enough. I have, from my earliest memories, I have tried to understand how things work. I just have a curiosity that doesn't stop. I take things apart, even at my advanced age, because I really want to know how things work. And the one thing I discovered is that the more you learn about things, the more stupid you realize you are. There's so much more to learn. Isn't that right, John? Have you ever stopped learning, John?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, which leads to kind of my first specific question. And it might surprise people listening, but the actual cell phone from the conception to the first prototype was, I believe in your book, 90 days. However, when you dig into that story, what I recognized was that you were poking your nose around everywhere, learning about Motorola's technology from every laboratory and every person. So by the time you took this, you created this impossible challenge to do it in 90 days because you had this meeting you wanted to show it at. Was this idea of poking around and knowing all the technology, was that important for the invention for this 90 days?
Absolutely, absolutely, because that first cell phone contained at least 7 or 8 technical breakthroughs, and you know that breakthroughs don't happen instantaneously.
Right.
We had been working on this whole concept of how important it is for people to be connected and connected without a wire, even though the phone company had told us for over 100 years, you got to have that wire.
Yeah.
So we learned about the need of people to have this connection over a large period of years. We've been working on pagers, car telephones, and the thing that, by the way, thank you very much for the nice comments about the book. You captured, it took me several hundred pages and you captured it in a couple of sentences, and I'm grateful for that. So I think you got the message.
So one of the things that kind of I got from this, because this is trying to show inventors at work, of which you're a most distinguished inventor, is that sort of nosiness must come along with being an inventor.
Well, it's nosiness, it's curiosity, but I cannot overemphasize the people part of it, that you have to understand people, because inventions don't mean anything unless they make people's lives better. And too many inventors create what they call an invention that's looking for a problem, and that's backwards.
Right.
What we engineers do is solve problems. The scientists investigate, they try to understand the nature of matter, of science. Engineers solve problems, and the only thing that matters when you solve a problem is the impact upon people, upon society.
Yeah, I noticed your the feeling that I had in reading the book and about your life, about people, and this is several places in the book you've talked about that you were one of the few executives that could go up to somebody and give them a hug because you thought that they were doing a great job or cherished the relationship. And I didn't meet a lot of senior executives that would do that. So that must be another part of sort of people being important to you.
Well, it is. I don't know how politically correct that is nowadays.
Right.
I don't like to talk about how old I am, but there were very few female engineers. In fact, when I started in my initial career, I think there was one engineer in the first 10 or 15 years who was not a male. So I didn't have any problems with being politically correct with giving guys a hug. Of course, they see through that pretty quick, John.
Right.
Don Linder, the guy that was the leader of the engineering side of the building that first cell phone, every time I'd hug him, he'd say, "Well, what do you want now, Marty?" So,
So there's always something.
He saw through it.
Well, it seems like, you called yourself a nerd in the book and that you were also a voracious reader, but I was also very curious that you also talked about your interest early days with cars and taking cars apart. So it seems like you were a nerd, but you had this broad range of things that you were interested in. Would that be correct?
I am. I'm interested in virtually everything, and I want to understand everything. I've had some failures in my life. One of them is quantum mechanics. I really have read as much as I could understand, and I have no idea how a quantum computer works, other than it works on probabilities. And the other one that is a failure is I know all of the attributes of a blockchain, but I still don't know what the mathematics of blockchain is, and I've given up on that one. So, but there are lots of other things to learn about.
Well, you're very humble, because in reading your book about mathematics as an electrical engineer myself, I noted the meeting you had at Bell, AT&T, with Dr. Shannon, and Shannon Nyquist are the fathers of signal processing, basically, as letters are to words and words are to prose. So Nyquist criteria is to signal processing. And I found it fascinating that on the blackboard at Bell Labs, you had to derive the Shannon Nyquist criteria. I honestly couldn't do that, and I looked it up to try to figure out how to do it. Boy, I don't know how you would have remembered all that mathematics.
Yeah, well, it turns out if you're really stupid about things, sometimes you do shortcuts and you figure out how things work. But that was one of the most key things of my career. When Motorola approached me, I was working for a company called Teletype.
Right.
If you guys are too young to remember what a teletype machine is.
Not me.
I know, but Motorola interviewed me, and they had two PhDs interrogating me and leading me through this, developing the Nyquist criterion. And I was so impressed by the fact that these guys were interested in the technology, and they were not trying to sell me. They were trying to find out whether I was any good at anything. So I've used that example in virtually every engineering interview I did for the next 10 or 15 years. So,
I'm glad I didn't have to interview with you.
you would have done fine, John.
Now, we're going to take a short break here, and we're going to come back to how this whole thing started with the dream you had in the Navy.
This is Invent Anything's Inventors at Work. Check us out at ipcg.com. And if you're an inventor, tell us about your inventions. And now, back to John Cronin.
This is Invent Anything's Inventors at Work, and I'm John Cronin, and we're here in a fabulous interview with Marty Cooper, who is not only the author of this great book I think everyone should read, Cutting the Cord, but he is known as the father of the cell phone. And I want to pick up where we left off in daydreaming. Martin, in the book, you actually talked about something that I highlighted directly, and it was that you sort of got your start when the Navy had straightened you out, you said. And of course, everyone, I'm sure that's watching, thanks you for your service in the Navy, because you do give up part of your life for service. But you had mentioned that you were thinking about wanting to be an engineer, and even more importantly, daydreaming of inventing things. So do you think this kind of whole concept of being an inventor was kind of embedded in you somehow, that you needed to do this?
Well, I can't do a self-analysis, John, but you would think that the thing I'd be most proud of my life is a cell phone, although I've had other ideas that have matured. The thing I'm most proud of is a statement, a quotation that I made up in a meeting one day, and somebody wrote it down. The best way to think out of the box is to not create the box in the first place. and it's so much of our lives are put in boxes. We keep identifying school subjects like arithmetic, geometry. You don't solve problems with single things. You solve problems with general knowledge about everything. So I am totally undisciplined. It took me about 30 years to figure out that I'm the world's worst executive because I'm not, I don't like to focus. I like to let my mind run free. And, Andrew Carnegie said that the best attribute of an executive is when he comes to work in the morning, he does the hardest things first. And I have exactly the opposite viewpoint. I do the things that are the most fun first, and sometimes never get around to doing the hard stuff.
So you mentioned, and when I read your book, that a lot of people quote, think out of the box, but you said that we shouldn't even have the boxes. And I've had this on my desk for years. The sort of thinking out of the box was given to me by a friend. And
I love it. I love it.
And I was thinking I should throw this thing away right away because there shouldn't even be a box. I thought that was great. I'd like to move some of the questions to the folks, the inventors that, and especially corporate inventors, because I know you're both an entrepreneur, small ideas and small companies, but also Motorola was a big part of your experience. You mentioned something, and almost this could be a hornet's nest, I think, that breakthroughs happen when the environment is conducive to it. Could you tell us about that?
Well, certainly. The thing that attracted me, first of all, to Motorola was the founder of Motorola was an entrepreneur. His name was Paul Galvin. He was not an engineer, but he did recognize market needs, and he also recognized engineering talent and was good at hiring people. And the statement that he had was actually engraved on a plaque in the lobby of Motorola's headquarters. Do not fear failure, reach out. And I took that seriously. And you should know, John, that I've had my share of failures because if you don't try something and try to do it differently than other people have done it, you just will not succeed every time. You will have some failures. And for 29 years, Motorola tolerated my failures. Fortunately, I had enough winners to compensate for that. But I would think that that is the most important thing. If you're cautious, if you're afraid to take a chance, don't become an inventor. Don't become.
Wow.
There are no sure things in invention. You can have the most perfect invention, but if you miss out on something, whether it's a detail, whether it's whatever, you may have a failure, and you go on to the next one.
Wow. And I certainly get this whole idea of inventors have to deal with failure here. You know, when you talked about in your book about where the mobile phones were, or the mobile devices in cars early days, and for those people listening, we're talking about a career in Motorola for 30 years, from early inventions in the late 50s all the way up to when you left. But when you got started in this business, and I don't know many people would really know this if they hadn't lived through it, is the original phones in cars were like CB radios almost, where the trunk had a huge part of the receivers and transmitters, right? I mean, they were taking up an entire trunk of a car, basically, weren't they?
You bet. The transmitter and receiver were in the trunk, as you point out. They could weigh as much as 40 pounds just for those two devices. The cable itself that went from the trunk to the front of the car weighed about 10 times as much as a modern cell phone. and then besides that, you had a control head and a microphone and all kinds of stuff. So it was a mess. And as you point out, it really was like a CB radio. It was press to talk. Because there were so few base stations, the range was limited. The skill of a person using a phone was to be able to detect the voice out of all the noise, because sometimes you would deal with negative signal and noise. So
right.
So it was very, very different than what we call cellular telephony today.
So if you think about it, you actually got involved in this whole area where the starting point was something that was really a push to talk, and it was a 40-pound thing in the trunk. And then you decided to take this on as this sort of wonder star, as I would think you were at Motorola. Well, you had to figure out, and we're going to be careful about all this, we're going to figure out in these couple of questions, we actually had to work with this thing called AT&T and the Giant.
Yeah.
And basically, you were trying to convince this giant to have Motorola get a contract to work on the IMTS, the interim mobile telephone system. How did you actually get Motorola into Bell Labs and AT&T? What do you think the trick there was?
Well, it turns out it was just very simple, John. We were focused. The whole function of my division of Motorola was to do two-way radios. We were solving people's problems. The kinds of people we were dealing with were business people and public safety. And they discovered very early in the technology that they could not run a police department. You couldn't run a concrete company without having continuous communications, and so you could manage all your mobile assets. And then the Bell system, and by the way, I prefer to use that term, John, because I don't want AT&T to cut off my cellular service. but this was the old AT&T.
Right.
But the Bell system was very conservative. They were a monopoly. They didn't have to do anything to control the marketplace, because they were the marketplace. They were the largest company in the world by every single measure, and they decided what we were going to have. If in my early days, if you wanted a telephone in your house, you had to rent it from the phone company, and it was a black phone, because that's all they had.
That's all you had?
That's a, so they decided that they were going to come up with this, what you refer to as an interim thing, which you could tell they weren't marketers. Who would ever buy something that was an interim? But Bell Laboratories ran that program called the IMTS program, and they were trying to move car telephones one level up. So you had multiple channels, so you could get some a little better service than they'd had before. And the Bell system management told Bell Labs, you go out and find the best people to do this, but do not go to Motorola, because Motorola has been a thorn in our side for years. And they keep trying to interfere with our business and do things in their own way. But to be complete, the Bell Labs people did come to Motorola. And their conclusion, time after time, every time they'd come and interview us, that there was no one else in the business qualified to build this new IMTS phone.
Right.
And let me tell you, John, that was a hard problem for us because we had a lot of, I'm sure you're very sensitive, having been an inventor yourself, to the need to keep your secrets confidential.
Yeah.
And that was one of the lessons I learned from my management. My boss at the time was a guy named Art Reese. He said, Marty, I don't think you're going to get this job with the Bell system. But if you have any chance at all, you're going to have to give it everything you've got. You're going to have to tell them everything you know and forget about secrecy. And we took that seriously, and we ended up with essentially controlling. We became almost a monopoly for IMTS.
Right. Exactly.
For a period of years, our market share was, we were not permitted to even talk about it because we were afraid the Justice Department would come after us, but we had about a 90% market share of IMTS.
Right. Now, I'm sort of unlayering the onion here from your early start with being totally curious and being a nerd and having a dream about being an inventor and building things. But, setting the stage for everyone here prior to the cell phone invention, you were dealing with a trunk full of electronics at 40, 50 pounds. If that wasn't enough, then you had to go against a giant to convince them to work with you. And I think when we come back, we'll talk about this really interesting part of invention, which when you called it the magician table, I listened to that. I read it a number of times. I've never heard it described this way. But let's get into this when we come back about how an inventor can actually sell their inventions.
This is Invent Anything's Inventors at Work. Check us out at ipcg.com. And if you're an inventor, tell us about your inventions. And now, back to John Cronin.
This is Invent Anything's Inventors at Work, and I'm John Cronin. And I'm here interviewing Marty Cooper, who has written the book, Cutting the Cord. He's considered the father of the cell phone. And I'd like to start off by where we left off, which is asking the question about how inventors and invention, how do you sell it? And you talked a number of times in the book about this kind of magician's table. And I think that's just such a wonderful phrase that kind of puts in a capsule what inventors actually have to do to sell their ideas. Could you tell us a little bit about the magician's table and kind of how that worked?
Well, if you think about it, John, we spend a good part of our lives selling, convincing people, and I would sound repetitive. I talk to you about not holding back. The only way to get people's attention is to dazzle them, and so when we invited Bell Labs to come in and look at this technology, the first thing we did was dig into all of the technologies in the corporation that were relevant to this assignment. And we did a little dreaming about how this technology, some of it hadn't even been finished yet. It was in process. And so we used a little imagination, not a lot of imagination because we never told a lie, but we would literally put on a show. And this was, my boss was a guy named John Mitchell at the time, and he was a great engineer, but also a showman. We built a little table with a wall on it so people could not see what was on the table. And we would say, the big problem now is intermodulation. And how do you solve intermodulation? Here's how we do it. We pull out a duplexer and show people that this duplexer was about this big. And if it was going to go into a portable phone, it had to be this small. And we'd reach over and pull out a model of a small duplexer, which of course we hadn't invented yet, but you have to get people's attention, and you have to really persuade them of what the fundamental need is. And I would be beating it to death if I didn't mention people again. So if it doesn't make people's lives better, it's not really very useful.
Right. Been a person that has helped license and sell technology my whole life with patents. I can tell you that this idea of the magician's table is kind of a new bullet in my gun, because you're right. I think that absolutely getting people curious but not telling them the answer until you pull it out of the table is much better than telling them the answer that they need to have. So that's I think is really incredible.
Well, let me make a quick comment. This is really way far out. This idea of a dazzling demonstration, the biggest example we've got of that now is Putin and the Ukraine. Think about that. About he wanted to make a point, and they must have spent $1 billion just putting all those soldiers along the Ukrainian border. That is nothing more than a dazzling demonstration. Of course, he goes to war, then it's one step further than that.
Right.
But you do have to be, if you're going to be a successful inventor, somebody has got to do the salesmanship.
Right.
And there's no better salesman than the inventor himself.
Right. Now we're going to get to the big invention.
Excuse me, or herself.
Or herself, right. We're going to get to the big invention with the cell phone, and I know you've got one to show us, but most inventors may just have one invention. You have many, and they're at different levels. And I want to talk really about the calibrator in the next set of questions, and then go to the quartz area that we had to fix that problem. Because I want people to understand that you were solving problems at many different levels. So you had mentioned that you were daydreaming at one point riding a car, and it occurred to you that you could improve the calibrator of tuning, taking the experts out, taking the servicemen out, and that became an incredible idea that ended up, I'm sure, saving lots of money. But you mentioned you were daydreaming in the car, and then all of a sudden this idea came to you. Do you at all remember what you were daydreaming about?
I'm so sorry. You want to step back a bit because
Yeah. When you were in a car, you're riding around. I think you talked about at Motorola, different people took different turns driving into work, and you were thinking about the IMTS calibrator and how you could eliminate experts from testing all the defects you were having in the radios, and you came up with this invention almost when you're riding the car. And I was just interested in you. You've talked about daydreaming so much. It seems like that's one of the traits of inventors.
I think so. I think we're back to this issue of thinking out of the box. And you really have to think broadly about the entire problem. And it occurred to me that we had never had that problem before. All our two-way radios had either one channel or two channels. The frequency calibrator, the frequency sources were quartz crystals. They weren't very reliable at the time. And it occurred to me that if this two-way radio business, the IMTS business, would be successful, there's no way that we were going to have every service shop have a multi-$1,000 frequency calibrator. And this is an ego trip for me, John, so you'll forgive me. I try to be humble all the time. It's not very hard for a guy like me to be humble. But I thought about the ability to generate a bunch of frequency spikes and not have to know exactly what frequency they are, or just have a relative frequency measurement where you could listen to a tone and you would reduce the tone to as low as you could hear, and then have a flashing light. So it was a no-brainer. And the thing that was an ego trip for me is that I thought about this idea, I designed the circuitry, I sold the marketing people on the importance of this thing. So it was an exercise in really understanding the whole process of invention, not just the idea, and not just solving one problem, but looking at both the technical and the marketing problems. So once again, I'm beating this thing to death. The whole concept of invention is building on skills, building on your knowledge skills, building on the marketing skills, building on understanding of what people's needs are. And none of that happens in a eureka moment. It is a lifetime endeavor.
Yes, I mean, that fundamental concept that you did in the calibrator has been used over and over and over again in all sorts of different technologies by giving audio and visual responses back to a person tuning some sort of circuit or some sort of process. And I've seen it forever. And I was fascinated that back in the late 50s, you had daydreamed in a car, came up with an idea, made it work, and then it becomes the basis for so many other things. And so when you're noted as the father of the cell phone, what I'm exploring is on your journey to get to the cell phone, you produced incredible different things. And basically, you actually mentioned at this point in your life that by doing the whole thing all the way through, that you got to the point that you had self-confidence. That in your book, you mentioned you became self-confident that you could become a working inventor. From product launch, all that changed. Can you talk at all about, like, you didn't have it, then you did get it, and what that made happen after that self-confidence?
Well, I know you express it so well. I can't really go beyond what you said. You have to believe in yourself, and you have to, because the first thing that happens when you think out of the box is everybody tells you how crazy you are, and how impossible things are, and how things can't be done. It's so much easier to, and by the way, that's the first thing that happens when an inventor goes to a venture capitalist. They will tell him why all the reasons why it can't be done. And if you listen to them, you'll never do anything. So it takes persistence, and it takes a thick enough skin so that when you do fail, you fall to the floor, get back up again, and keep punching away.
That's wonderful. And when we come back, another building block that you just happened to do on the way to the cell phone is how you mastered how to put 100 transistors in one box for the first time in the world, I think paving the way for VLSI. So we'll get back to that when we come back.
This is Invent Anything's Inventors at Work. Check us out at ipcg.com. And if you're an inventor, tell us about your inventions.